Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I was living in a small, old apartment building on the outskirts of my college town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap and close enough to campus to walk. The building was quiet, usually inhabited by students and older couples. I'd lived there for about 6 months, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary until one night in October. It was a Thursday, and I'd stayed late at the library, cramming for midterms. By the time I got home, it was almost midnight. The streetlights cast eerie shadows on the cracked pavement as I walked toward the entrance of my building. I felt a slight chill, but brushed it off as the October air. As I unlocked the front door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, I noticed something strange. A man was standing at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden in shadow. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his back to me. I froze, my keys still in my hand. The man didn't look familiar, and I knew everyone in the building at least by sight. He was tall and wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his features. I hesitated, wondering if I should say something, but the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Trying to act casual, I quickly walked to my apartment, which was thankfully only a few doors down from the entrance. As I unlocked my door, I glanced back. The man hadn't moved. I went inside, locked the deadbolt, and exhaled a shaky breath. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, I thought, trying to calm myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned off the lights in my living room and peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Maybe he'd left. Relieved, I decided to shower and get ready for bed. About 20 minutes later, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from my front door. My heart stopped. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound came again, long, deliberate scratches, as if someone was dragging their nails down the wood. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. The scratching stopped, then came a quiet knock. Who was it? I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I looked through the peephole again, but all I could see was darkness. Whoever it was had covered the peephole. I backed away, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Before I could decide, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking away from my door and down the hallway. I stayed up all night, listening for any sound of him coming back. The next morning, I told my landlord about what happened, and he promised to check the security cameras. Later that day, he called me, his voice unusually tense. I don't know how to tell you this, he said, but the cameras didn't catch anyone entering or leaving the building around the time you got home last night. And there's no footage of anyone standing in the hallway. The story didn't end when I moved out. I'd like to say that leaving that apartment erased the memory of what happened, but it didn't. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my new place. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every strange noise made me jump. I chalked it up to paranoia until something happened that made me question everything. About a month after I moved, I received a package I hadn't ordered. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. The handwriting on the label was shaky, almost childlike, and spelled my name perfectly. My stomach churned as I stared at it. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was a picture of the hallway outside my old apartment, taken from the perspective of someone standing at the far end, the same spot where I'd seen the man. There was no one in the photo, just the empty corridor bathed in dim yellow light. But something was written on the back of the picture in the same shaky handwriting. Miss May. I felt sick. How did this person know where I lived now? How did they even know I had moved? I immediately called the police and filed a report. They took the package and photo as evidence, but I could tell by the officer's skeptical expression that they didn't think much would come of it. After that, I became hypervigilant. I changed my routines, never walked anywhere alone, and started locking every door and window even during the day. Weeks passed without any further incidents, and I started to relax, thinking maybe whoever it was had finally lost interest. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, the faint glow of my bedside lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. It was quiet, too quiet, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching, faint but deliberate, coming from my front door. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to get up, but fear held me down, pinning me to the mattress. This time, I didn't call out. I didn't dare move. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few minutes. Then came the knock, soft, almost polite. My chest felt like it was going to explode from the pressure of holding my breath. I reached reached for my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator stayed on the line with me as I whispered what was happening. I didn't dare approach the door or look through the peephole. I just stayed frozen in my room until I heard the knock again, this time louder, more insistent. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the hallway was empty. No sign of forced entry, no marks on the door, nothing to indicate someone had been there. The officers assured me they would patrol the area and advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. I took their advice and crashed on a friend's couch. The next morning, I returned to my apartment to find something waiting for me. Taped to my door was another photograph. This one was of me asleep in my bed. The police took the new evidence seriously this time. They told me to pack a bag and stay somewhere safe while they investigated. I stayed with friends for weeks, too terrified to return. Eventually, I decided it wasn't worth the anxiety and broke my lease. I moved to a new city, far away from anyone who knew my old address. To this day, I don't know who it was, how they found me, or what they wanted, but every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I heard a knock. Even after moving to a new city, I couldn't shake the fear. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It felt deeper, more ingrained, like a permanent scar. For months, I avoided making friends or sharing too much about myself with anyone. I'd even kept my workplace vague when talking to neighbors. My therapist said it was PTSD, which made sense, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to sleep at night. The first 6 months in my new place were uneventful. Slowly, I started to relax. I didn't hear any strange noises, no mysterious packages arrived, and I began to believe that maybe I left it all behind. Maybe whoever or whatever had been stalking me finally gave up. I started feeling like a normal person again. Then it happened. It was a Saturday night, and I'd gone out with coworkers for drinks. It was the first time I'd really let loose since everything happened. I came home late, a little tipsy but happy. As I walked into my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, locked the door, and headed to the kitchen for some water. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a single, muddy footprint in the middle of my living room. It wasn't mine. The footprint was too big to belong to me, and the tread pattern didn't match any of my shoes. It looked fresh, as if someone had just stepped there moments before. My heart began to race as I scanned the room. Everything looked normal, nothing was out of place, but that didn't comfort me. I backed out of the living room and grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher that someone had been in my apartment. They told me to stay on the line and hide until the police arrived. I locked myself in the bathroom, clutching the knife and holding my breath. Every creak and groan of the old building made my heart pound. I was convinced whoever left that footprint was still in the apartment, hiding, waiting. The police arrived quickly, but their search turned up nothing. No sign of forced entry, no one hiding in closets or under the bed. They looked at the footprint and suggested it could have been an old mark I hadn't noticed before, maybe tracked in by a maintenance worker. But I knew better. The footprint wasn't there when I left that evening. Someone had been inside while I was out. The police installed extra locks on my doors and advised me to get a security system. I followed their advice, even adding cameras inside and outside my apartment. For weeks, I felt like I was under siege in my own home, constantly checking the footage for any sign of someone lurking nearby. One night, as I was reviewing the day's recordings, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At 2:37 a.m., while I was sound asleep, the hallway camera outside my apartment captured a figure standing outside my door. It was blurry, but the person was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over their face. They stood there for several minutes, motionless, before leaning down as if to listen at the door. Then they turned and walked away. The footage sent me spiraling into a panic. I sent it to the police, but by the time they arrived, the person was long gone. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but it didn't feel like enough. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed a bag and stayed in a hotel, then made plans to move again, this time without telling anyone where I was going. I'm writing this now from another new apartment in another new city. It's been a year since I last saw the footage of the man outside my door. Maybe it's over, maybe they finally stopped, but I still can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I double check my locks every night, and I never leave home without looking over my shoulder, and sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear a faint knock at the door. I was home for summer break, staying with my parents in the small, rural town where I grew up. Our house was on the edge of a dense forest, and I always loved exploring the trails there. It was peaceful, quiet, and a great way to clear my mind. That summer, though, I had an experience that made me never want to go back. One afternoon, I decided to take a long hike. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I let my mom know where I was going and headed out. The weather was perfect, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I felt a at ease as I wandered deeper into the woods, following a trail I'd been on dozens of times before. After about an hour, I came to a fork in the path. Normally, I'd go right toward a small lake, but for some reason, I felt like going left. I hadn't been down that trail in years, and curiosity got the better of me. The path was overgrown, but I pushed through the bushes and kept walking. It felt exciting to be somewhere I hadn't been in so long, almost like an adventure. About 20 minutes in, I started to notice something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind, had quieted. It wasn't completely silent, but it was noticeably different. I told myself I was imagining things and kept going. That's when I saw it. Ahead of me, just off the trail, was a small clearing. In the center was a wooden structure, almost like a shack or a hunting blind. It was old and looked like it had been there for years. I'd never seen it before, and I was certain it hadn't been there the last time I'd hiked this trail. Curiosity got the better of me again, and I stepped off the path to get a closer look. The shack was crude, made of weathered wood and rusted nails. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Still, I leaned closer to peek inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out a few objects: an old chair, a filthy blanket on the floor, and what looked like empty food wrappers scattered around. It reeked of rot and mildew. I decided I'd seen enough and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps got louder, closer. Then I heard a voice, low and gruff. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I spun around and saw a man emerging from the trees. He was tall, unkempt, and had a wild look in his eyes. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he was carrying something in his hand, a hatchet. I stammered something about being lost, my mind racing. The man just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, not daring to look back. I could hear him yelling after me, but I couldn't make out the words. My only focus was on getting away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I made it back to the main trail and then to the edge of the woods. I didn't stop until I was inside my house, slamming the door behind me. My mom was startled and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't even explain. I just said I'd seen something in the woods and didn't want to go back. I later told a friend about the shack, and he said he'd heard rumors about someone living in the woods, an old hermit or drifter who didn't like people trespassing on his land. I don't know if that's who I encountered, and frankly, I don't care. All I know is that I never went back to that part of the forest. The days following the encounter were rough. I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. His dirty clothes, the way he smiled like he knew something I didn't. I kept telling myself I was safe, that I'd gotten away, but a part of me felt like I'd left something unfinished. Who was he? Why was he out there? And most importantly, what would have happened if I hadn't run? A week passed, and I started to feel a little more normal. I avoided the woods entirely, even though they were a huge part of my life growing up. I stayed close to home and made excuses when my friends asked me to go hiking or camping. I didn't want to tell anyone what happened. It sounded crazy, like something out of a bad horror movie. One night, though, something happened that pulled me right back into the fear. It was late, maybe around midnight. My parents had already gone to bed, and I was in my room scrolling on my phone. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wood floors. I just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I thought it was just tree branches swaying in the wind, but then it happened again and again. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be the wind. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard something else, footsteps, this time outside, moving along the side of the house. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, staying low so I wouldn't be seen. Slowly, I peeked out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Still, I knew someone was out there. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel eyes on me. It was the same feeling I'd had in the woods, that sense of being watched. Trying to keep calm, I texted my dad, who was just down the hall. "Someone's outside. I think they're at my window." Seconds later, I heard his door open, followed by the unmistakable sound of him cocking his old shotgun. He flicked on the floodlights outside, and I heard him shout, "Who's out there? Show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the woods at the edge of our property, I heard movement, branches snapping and leaves rustling, like someone running away. My dad stood on the porch for a while, scanning the tree line, but whoever it was had disappeared into the night. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt outside my window. They were large, clearly made by a man, and they led straight to the woods. My dad called the local sheriff, who came out to take a look. The officer was nice enough, but didn't seem overly concerned. "Probably just a drifter," he said. "We get them around here here sometimes. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. The prints were fresh, and they were too close to my window for comfort. I couldn't prove it, but I knew it was him, the man from the shack. Somehow, he'd found out where I lived. After that night, my dad installed extra locks on all the doors and windows, and we made a habit of keeping the floodlights on at night. I didn't see or hear anything unusual for the rest of the summer, but I never truly felt safe again. When it was time to go back to college, I left with a sense of relief. I still come home to visit my parents, but I avoid the woods entirely. Even now, years later, I get chills thinking about that summer. Who was that man? What did he want? I'll probably never know. Years passed, and the encounter slowly faded into a memory, though the unease never quite left me. I graduated from college, got a job, and moved to a nearby city. I visited my parents occasionally, but I always avoided staying overnight, using work as an excuse. The woods no longer felt like the safe haven they once were. Then, about 2 months ago, my mom called me out of the blue. Her voice had an edge of nervousness I hadn't heard before. "Do you remember that weird man in the woods?" she asked. My heart sank. "Yeah, why?" She explained that my dad had been out back, doing some yard work near the tree line, when he noticed something strange, a small pile of objects neatly arranged at the base of a tree. When he looked closer, he saw they weren't just random items. There was an old, rusted knife, a crumpled piece of paper with my name scrawled on it, and a small bundle of twigs tied together with twine. It looked like some kind of crude effigy. My dad hadn't mentioned it to her at first, thinking it was just a prank or coincidence. But when he found a second pile a few days later, this time with what looked like a torn piece of fabric from a shirt I left at their house years ago, he decided it wasn't something he could ignore. Fury, this sent me into a full-blown panic. I told my mom to call the sheriff immediately, but she hesitated. What if it's just some kids messing around? She said, "I don't want to bother anyone if it's nothing." I insisted, and thankfully she listened. The sheriff came out, took some photos, and filed a report. He promised to have someone patrol the area more frequently, but there wasn't much else he could do without more evidence. A week later, my dad called me this time. His voice was low, like he didn't want my mom to overhear. "We found a trail camera," he said. Apparently, while clearing some brush near the edge of the woods, he'd stumbled upon a small, camouflage trail camera strapped to a tree. It wasn't his, and he'd never seen it before. He brought it inside and tried to check the footage, but the memory card was missing. Someone had been watching the house. That was the final straw for me. I told my parents they needed to get out of there, at least for a while. They were reluctant. They'd lived in that house for decades, and moving wasn't something they wanted to consider. But I was terrified for them. Things went quiet for a while after that. No more piles of objects, no strange noises in the night. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. But then, last week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope with my name on it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 5 words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You can't hide forever." I immediately called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The envelope didn't have any fingerprints or clues to who had sent it. I knew in my gut it was him. Now, I'm living with this constant anxiety, checking my locks 3 times before bed, looking over my shoulder wherever I go. My parents finally agreed to install security cameras around their property, but they still refuse to move. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. To the man in the woods, wherever you are, I don't know what you want, and I don't care. Just leave us alone, and let's not meet ever again. I lived in a small, quiet town at the time, working late shifts at a diner. My shifts often ended around midnight, and since I didn't have a car, I'd walk home, which took about 20 minutes. One night, as I was walking down the main road toward my apartment, I noticed a red car parked under a flickering streetlight. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars parked along the road were unusual, even late at night, but as I got closer, I noticed a man sitting in the driver's seat. He was staring straight ahead, not moving, and the engine was off. I felt uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing. People have every right to park their cars and sit in them, right? I kept walking, trying not to look directly at him, but as I passed, I felt his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. About a block later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine starting. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the red car pulling out and driving slowly in my direction. Panic started to set in, but I kept walking, trying not to let my fear show. Maybe he's just going in the same direction, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned down a quieter street toward my apartment, the car turned too. It was moving at a crawl, keeping pace with me. My mind raced. I didn't want to go straight home. If he was following me, I didn't want him to know where I lived. So I decided to take a detour and head toward a gas station that stayed open late. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. The car sped up too. That's when I heard the window roll down and the man called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" "No, thank you," I shouted back without turning around. He didn't stop. He kept following me, his car now creeping just a few feet behind me. "Come on, on, don't be like that. Let me give you a ride. It's not safe out here. I ignored him and broke into a full sprint, heading for the gas station. My chest was tight with fear, and I could hear the car speeding up behind me. I thought for sure he was going to hit me or block my path, but then I saw the bright lights of the gas station up ahead. The red car suddenly slammed on the brakes. I glanced back and saw it make a sharp U-turn before speeding off into the night. I stumbled into the gas station, shaking and out of breath. The cashier gave me a concerned look as I explained what had happened. He offered to call the police, but I declined. At the time, I was too scared to think clearly and convinced myself it was over. I stayed at the gas station for about an hour until I felt safe enough to walk home. After that night, I started being extra cautious on my walks home. I began taking different routes every night, even though it added extra time to my journey. I also started carrying a small can of pepper spray, just in case. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. I didn't see the red car, and I started convincing myself that it had just been some creep who decided to move on. But then one night, something happened that brought all my fear rushing back. It was a Friday, and the diner was busier than usual. I ended up staying late to help clean up, so it was nearly 1 a.m. by the time I left. The streets were completely deserted as I started my walk home. The air was heavy and still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About halfway home, I heard the faint sound of tires behind me. My stomach dropped. I didn't even need to turn around to know it was him. The car's engine was quiet, but the steady, deliberate pace of the vehicle trailing me was unmistakable. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there it was, the same red car. My heart was pounding in my ears as I tried to think. I could run, but where? There was no gas station nearby this time, and I didn't want to lead him to my apartment. I spotted a narrow alley up ahead and decided to take my chances. Maybe I could lose him. I darted into the alley and started sprinting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The alley twisted and turned, and I could hear the car's engine revving as it tried to follow from the adjacent street. I was almost out of the alley when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The red car was waiting for me at the other end. I froze, my mind racing. He must have known this alley led back to the main road. As I stood there, paralyzed, the driver's door opened and the man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. "Why are you running?" he called out, his voice cold and even. "I just want to talk." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run the other way, but before I could move, I heard another voice behind me. "Hey, what's going on here?" I turned to see a man walking his dog, staring at the red car and its driver with suspicion. The man in the red car hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the dog walker. Without a word, he got back in his car, slammed the door, and sped off. The dog walker stayed with me until I calmed down and called the police. This time, I filed a report and gave them as much detail as I could about the man in his car. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but they never found him. After I moved, things were peaceful for a while. I found a new job and an apartment in a much busier area of a nearby city. It felt good to finally be somewhere I didn't feel the constant need to look over my shoulder. I even convinced myself that the man in the red car was a distant, eerie memory, something I could leave behind like the small town I'd escaped from. But then, about 6 months after I'd settled into my new place, I received a package. It was a small, nondescript brown box with no return address. At first, I thought it was a delivery mistake. I wasn't expecting anything, but curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. Inside was a single item, a cheap plastic keychain in the shape of a red car. My heart dropped. My mind immediately raced back to that night and the man who had followed me. There was no note, no explanation, just the keychain. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. I threw the keychain away, locked all my doors, and spent the rest of the night trying to rationalize what had happened. How would he know where I lived? Was it really him, or was I just being paranoid? Either way, I decided not to take any chances. The next morning, I reported it to the police. The officer I spoke to took me seriously, which was a relief. He told me to be cautious and to keep any further packages or correspondence that might arrive. He also suggested changing up my routines, like when I left for work or came home, and recommended installing a security camera. I followed his advice to the letter. Weeks went by and nothing else happened. I started to relax, thinking maybe it really had been a coincidence. But then, one evening as I was coming home, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked a few houses down from my apartment was a red car. It wasn't the exact same one. I'd memorized the old one's shape and details, but this one was eerily similar. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see inside, but it felt like someone was watching me. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, debating whether to go inside or keep walking. I decided to keep walking. I circled the block and called a friend, asking them to come meet me. When we returned together about 15 minutes later, the car was gone. At this point, I knew I was being watched. I doubled down on my security measures, cameras, adding extra locks, upgrading my security camera, and even sleeping with a weapon close by. I also started carpooling to and from work with a coworker, making sure I was never alone. For a while, nothing happened, no more packages, no sign of the car. I began to think maybe he had moved on. But then, one night while reviewing my security camera footage, I saw him. The man was standing in my driveway, just outside the camera's range, staring at my apartment. He was wearing the same dark jacket and hood. He stood there for several minutes, motionless, before slowly walking back toward the street. I couldn't see where he went, but it was enough to shatter any sense of safety I had left. I called the police immediately and showed them the footage. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out, but they admitted there wasn't much they could do unless he directly threatened me. That was the last straw. I packed up and moved again, this time to a new city and a completely different state. It's been over a year since then, and I haven't seen or heard anything unusual, but I still live with the lingering fear that he's out there, waiting, watching, planning. To the man in the red car, I don't know who you are, and I don't care to know, but if you ever come near me again, I won't run. I'll be ready. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was about an hour away from my house. The road I was on was long, mostly surrounded by trees, with only the occasional flickering streetlight. I had my music playing low and was sipping on the cold coffee I picked up at a gas station earlier when I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe trash someone had left, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man. He was waving his arms in a slow, almost robotic motion, signaling for help. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to keep driving, but I couldn't help feeling bad. What if he was hurt or stranded? I stopped the car a little ahead of him and cracked my window just enough to talk. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. The man jogged up to my window. His clothes were dirty, his face pale, and his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't seem to focus on me, as if he was looking just past me. I ran out of gas. He said in a monotone voice, "Can you give me a ride to the nearest station?" My skin crawled. Something about it just felt off. I glanced at the road behind me, completely empty. No other cars, no witnesses. "Sorry," I said quickly, "but I can call someone for you." He tilted his head, staring at me for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's okay," he said softly. "I'll just wait." He backed away from my car, but he didn't step off the road. Instead, he just stood there watching me. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his smile stayed fixed on his face. I didn't waste another second. I drove off, keeping an eye on him in my rearview mirror. As my car gained speed, he turned and started walking down the road in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, I saw headlights approaching from behind. Relieved that someone else was on the road, I slowed down slightly, but as the car passed me, I noticed something chilling. It was the same man. He was sitting in the passenger seat of the car, staring directly at me. I don't know how he got picked up so quickly or how he managed to be in that car, but I didn't stick around to find out. I floored it and didn't stop until I reached my driveway. After that night, I tried to convince myself it was all just a strange coincidence. Maybe the guy had somehow flagged down another driver right after I left. Maybe he wasn't as eerie as he seemed in the dark, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It started small. I'd get the sense that I wasn't alone when walking to my car, or I'd hear faint noises outside my house at night. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. My mind played tricks on me because of the encounter, but then the incidents got harder to explain. One night, about a week after the drive, I was getting ready for bed when I heard what sounded like tapping on the living room window. It was faint, irregular, but distinct enough to catch my attention. My heart sank. I turned off the lights and crept toward the window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing, just the empty street outside. I tried to laugh it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my front door rattling as if someone was trying to turn the knob. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and stayed perfectly still, listening. The rattling stopped, but I swear I could hear faint breathing on the other side of the door. I called the police. When they arrived, they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably a prank or my imagination, but I knew better. The next morning, I noticed something chilling. My car, parked in the driveway, had a smear of dirt on the driver's side window, like someone had pressed their hand against it. There were also faint streaks, as if they had been peering inside. I felt sick. I decided to stay at a friend's place for a few nights. While I was gone, I set up a cheap security camera pointed at my front door. When I reviewed the footage after returning, my worst fears were confirmed. At around around 2:30 a.m., the camera caught a figure standing in my driveway. It was blurry and dark, but I recognized the posture, the way his head tilted slightly to the side. It was him. He stood there for what felt like hours, motionless, staring at my front door. Then, just before dawn, he walked away and disappeared down the street. I called the police again, showing them the footage. They took it more seriously this time, but they still didn't have much to go on. I changed my locks, installed more cameras, and even started parking my car in the garage. The visit stopped after that. Weeks passed, then months, and I began to feel normal again. But every so often, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I've heard that faint tapping on the window again. Life eventually settled down, but the unease never fully left me. Even though the visits seemed to have stopped, I became hypervigilant. I'd double check every lock, glance over my shoulder when walking to my car, and take alternate routes home just in case. My friends thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. About 6 months after the initial encounter, I was finally starting to relax. I convinced myself it was over, that whoever that man was, he had moved on. I even began going out more, trying to reclaim my life. One night, I stayed late at a friend's house for a game night. It was fun, almost enough to make me forget everything, but as I was driving home, that familiar unease crept in. The road was eerily similar to the one where I'd first seen him, dark, quiet, lined with trees. My heart started racing, and I couldn't stop glancing in my rearview mirror. At first, it was empty, but then, about 10 minutes from home, headlights appeared in the distance behind me. They seemed harmless at first, just another car heading the same direction. But as I drove, they stayed uncomfortably close, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I went. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But when I turned onto my street, the car followed. My stomach dropped. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass me, but they didn't. Instead, they kept their distance, trailing just far enough behind to stay in the shadows. I didn't pull into my driveway. Instead, I kept driving, looping around the block. The car followed every turn I made. That's when I knew I was being hunted. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I didn't want to lead them to my house, but I also didn't want to stop somewhere isolated. Finally, I remembered there was a 24-hour gas station a few miles away. I drove there, pulling into the brightly lit parking lot and parking right next to the entrance. The car didn't follow me in. Instead, it idled on the street for a moment before speeding off into the night. I sat there for a while, trying to calm my shaking hands. When I finally felt steady enough to drive, I asked the gas station attendant to watch me leave. He agreed, standing at the door as I drove off. I took the long way home, circling a few extra blocks just to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got home, I parked in the garage and locked every door and window. For the next few nights, I barely slept, jumping at every noise. Then, one morning, I found something that sent chills down my spine. On my front porch was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Written on it in shaky handwriting were 3 words, "I'll be back." I called the police again, but once again, there was little they could do. They suggested I install more cameras and maybe even get a security system. I did everything they recommended and even considered moving, but I couldn't afford to. It's been years since then, and I've never seen him again. But the fear never fully goes away. Every time I walk to my car or hear a noise at night, I wonder if he's out there, waiting, watching. I don't know why he targeted me or what he wanted, but I pray I'll never find out. It was a dingy little place in an older building, but it was cheap, and I was just starting out. The layout was basic, a long hallway with several apartments on each side, ending in a fire exit that opened onto the alley below. Most of my neighbors were quiet, and I didn't see them often, but there was one man who stood out. He lived at the very end of the hall, in the apartment next to the fire exit. I never learned his name, but I always called him the man at the end of the hall in my head. He was, I passed him in the hallway, and he'd just stare at me without saying a word. Not a polite nod, not a smile, just this unnervingly blank expression. He was tall and thin, with sunken cheeks and greasy black hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Something about him felt off, but I tried to brush it off. He never actually did anything, so I figured he was just socially awkward or maybe going through a rough time. Then things started getting weird. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. I'd come home to find my apartment door unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway late at night, even though most of my neighbors were older and went to bed early. Once, I swore I heard someone trying my door handle, but when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. One night, I came home late after a shift at work. The hallway lights were dim. One of the bulbs had burned out near the fire exit, leaving the end of the hall in shadows. As I walked toward my door, I saw movement out at the corner of my eye. I turned, and there he was, the man at the end of the hall. He was standing in the shadows, staring at me, but this time, he had a faint smile on his face. It wasn't friendly, it was predatory. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady city. He didn't answer. He just kept staring, that unsettling smile never leaving his face. My skin crawled, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. Something about the way he looked at me stuck in my mind, like a splinter I couldn't remove. I started avoiding him, timing my comings and goings so I wouldn't run into him. But one night, everything came to a head. It was around 2 a.m., and I was woken up by a noise, a faint scraping sound, like metal on wood. I froze, straining to hear. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. He was there. The man at the end of the hall was crouched down, fiddling with my door handle. In his hand was what looked like a screwdriver or some kind of tool. He was trying to break in. I backed away, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I whispered to the operator, explaining the situation as quietly as I could. The scraping stopped, and for a horrifying moment, I thought he might have heard me. But when I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. They searched the building and the alley, but they didn't find him. However, they did find evidence that he'd been tampering with my door lock. They advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, and I didn't argue. The next morning, I went to the building manager and told him everything. He was shocked but promised to look into it. A few days later, I learned that the man at the end of the hall had been evicted. Apparently, he hadn't been paying rent, and when they went to inspect his apartment, they found it completely trashed. Holes in the walls, piles of garbage, and photos. Photos of me. There were pictures of me walking to my car, checking my mail, even sitting in my apartment, taken through the gap in my curtains. I moved out immediately and never looked back. After I moved out, I tried my best to put it all behind me, but it wasn't easy. For weeks, I felt like I was being watched, even in my new apartment. I double-checked all my locks, kept the curtains tightly closed, and installed a security camera by my front door. My friends told me I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. A few months went by without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe he really was just some creepy loner who fixated on me for a while. Maybe it was over. I wanted to believe that. Then one night, I found a package on my doorstep. It didn't have a return address, just my name written in messy, almost childlike handwriting. My stomach dropped. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, my instincts screaming at me not to touch it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. I opened the box carefully, half expecting something horrible to jump out. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was me, taken recently at my new apartment. I was walking out the front door, completely unaware. Written on the back, in the same messy handwriting, were the words, "I found you." I called the police immediately, but there wasn't much they could do. Without any concrete evidence of who sent it, they couldn't make an arrest. I showed them the photo and explained everything, but all they could do was file a report and tell me to be careful. Terrified, I installed more security cameras, got pepper spray, and even started taking self-defense classes. But the worst part was the waiting. Every time I left my apartment, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be there. Every time I heard a noise outside, I thought he was coming for me. Then one night, it happened. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside my window. My heart sank. My new apartment was on the second floor, so there shouldn't have been anyone out there. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. There he was. The man from the end of the hall was standing on the fire escape, staring directly at me. He had that same twisted smile on his face, like he was enjoying my fear. In his hand, he held something shiny, a knife. I didn't hesitate. I called the police, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told the dispatcher what was happening and that I was alone. The operator stayed on the line with me, telling me to stay calm and that help was on the way. But then I heard it, the sound of the window latch being jiggled. He was trying to get in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and stood by the door ready to defend myself if he broke through. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, and he bolted. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. This time, they took me seriously. They combed the area, but once again, they didn't find him. The officers stayed with me while I packed a bag, and I went to stay with a friend for a while. I couldn't bear to be alone. Eventually, I moved again, this time to a different city, and I've done everything I can to stay off the radar. No social media, no forwarding address, nothing that could lead him to me. I still don't know how he found me after I moved the first time, but I can't let my guard down. Even after moving to a new city and going completely off-grid, I couldn't shake the lingering fear. I was hyper aware of every little thing, footsteps behind me on a quiet street, an unfamiliar car parked outside, even just a wrong number call. I kept telling myself that I was safe now, but my nerves refused to believe it. Months turned into a year, and nothing happened. No mysterious packages, no unnerving angry encounters, nothing. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I found a new job, made a few friends, and even started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma. For the first time in a long while, I felt normal again. Until last week. It was a Friday night, and I had plans to meet some friends for dinner. As I was leaving my apartment, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just a flyer or some junk, but when I pulled it out, my stomach dropped. It was a note. "You look happy. I'm glad you're settling in." No name, no signature, just that chilly message. My hands started shaking, and I immediately scanned the area, looking for anyone who might be watching me. The parking lot was mostly empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I canceled my plans and went straight to the police. They were sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do without a clear threat or evidence of who had left the note. They advised me to stay vigilant and report any further incidents. That night, I barely slept. I stayed up with every light in my apartment on, clutching the baseball bat I kept under my bed. Every little creak or sound outside sent me into a panic, but the night passed without incident. The next morning, I decided to review the footage from the security cameras I had installed around my apartment. Most of the recordings showed nothing unusual, just the occasional neighbor walking by our cars pulling in and out. But then, around 3 a.m., I saw the man from the end of the hall. He was standing just outside the range of one of the cameras, barely visible in the shadows. He must have known about the cameras because he never stepped fully into view, but I recognized his silhouette, the lanky frame, the hunched posture. He stood there for what felt like hours, just watching my apartment. At one point, he leaned forward as if trying to get a better look, then slipped away into the darkness. I felt sick. He had found me again. I packed a bag that same day and left town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I rented a room in a small motel several towns away and started looking for another place to live. I've done this enough times now that it feels almost routine. Find a new apartment, change all my contact information, install more cameras, and pray that he doesn't find me again. I don't know how he keeps tracking me down. I've considered everything. He could be hacking into my information somehow, following me without my knowledge, or maybe it's something even more sinister. All I know is that I can't let my guard down, not for a second. So, to the man at the end of the hall, I don't know why you're doing this. I don't know what you want or how you keep finding me, but I know one thing. I've always been pretty independent, so the idea of staying alone in an Arab in a quiet village in France didn't faze me. Looking back now, I wish I had been a little more cautious. The Arab was an old cottage on the outskirts of town. It was charming, with creaky wooden floors and ivy climbing up the walls. The host, Sylvie, messaged me beforehand, letting me know she wouldn't be there to greet me, but I left the key in a lockbox by the door. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. After finding the key and settling in, I made myself some tea and curled up with a book. It was incredibly peaceful until it wasn't. Around 10 p.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside the cottage. At first, I brushed it off as a stray animal or maybe a neighbor passing by, but then I heard the distinct sound of the front door handle rattling. My stomach dropped. I froze, clutching my phone, debating whether to call someone or check it out myself. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. I peeked through the curtains but couldn't see anyone. Trying to shake off the nerves, I convinced myself it was nothing and went to bed. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a creak. Not just any creak, the kind that comes from old wooden floors inside the house. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was inside could probably hear it. I strained to listen, and that's when I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the emergency number for France but couldn't bring myself to hit call. I didn't know if I was overreacting, and the idea of a language barrier made me hesitate. Instead, I texted Sylvie to ask if anyone else had access to the house. No reply. The footsteps got closer, heading toward the room I was in. I quietly slid out of bed, grabbed my small pocket knife, and positioned myself behind the door. My mind raced with every worst case scenario. The doorknob turned. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I'm calling the police." In lunge toward the door, from ever it was bolted. I heard their footsteps thundering down the stairs and the front door slamming shut. Still shaking, I locked myself in the bedroom and actually called the police this time. They arrived about 30 minutes later, but whoever had been there was long gone. They found the lockbox outside open and the spare key missing. The weirdest part, when Sylvie finally got back to me, she told me she had no idea who it could have been. She didn't have any cleaners or maintenance scheduled, and the lockbox had been intact when she checked it earlier that week. Needless to say, I cut my trip short and left the next morning. I've stayed in plenty of Arabs since, but I always double check every lock, and I've never gone back to that cottage. After returning home, I tried to put the whole experience behind me. I told a few close friends and family members who all had the same reaction, shock, followed by concern for my safety. Most chalked it up to some random thief or drifter who saw an opportunity, but the whole situation didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I received a message from Ambient. They were following up on my stay at Sylvie's property, which I had reported after the incident. To my surprise, they informed me that another guest had experienced something similar, someone attempting to enter the cottage during the night. The guest had also left early and filed a complaint, which led Ambient to investigate. The revelation was chilling. This wasn't a one-off, and it likely wasn't random. I reached out to Sylvie again, hoping to get more details. This time, she seemed a little more forthcoming. She admitted that, a few months before my stay, she'd had issues with her ex-partner. He was controlling and refused to accept their breakup. She claimed he had shown up uninvited at the cottage before, but assured me she thought the situation was under control. Under control. The spare key had gone missing, and someone had been creeping around her property at night. It seemed like she was trying to downplay everything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. I pushed Airbud for more information, but privacy policies kept them from sharing specifics about the other guests' experience. All they would say was that the listing had been removed while they conducted their investigation. I was left with more questions than answers. Was it Sylvie's ex, someone who had stayed there before and copied the key, or was it a local who knew the property well? Whatever the case, I'm just grateful I listened to my instincts that night. Even now, I occasionally wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I've heard someone creeping around. It's a fear that stays with you, that little voice whispering, what if? Months passed, and life moved on, but the experience stayed with me. Occasionally, I'd find myself googling Sylvie's village, checking the news for anything suspicious or related to break-ins or arrests. Nothing ever came up. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream. But then, one day, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line simply read, about the cottage. My stomach twisted as I opened it. The email was brief. I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't mean to scare you. I was looking for Sylvie. She didn't tell me someone else was staying there. I'll leave you alone now. No name, no details, and no way to reply. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Was it Sylvie's ex? Someone else? And how had they gotten my email? Airbud is supposed to keep that information private. Did Sylvie give it to them? Or had they found another way to track me down? I forwarded the email to Airbud immediately, demanding an explanation. Their response was polite but unhelpful. They assured me their systems were secure and suggested I change my email password just in case. They also reiterated that Sylvie's listing had been permanently removed. That night, as I tried to fall asleep, my mind replayed every detail of the email. I didn't mean to scare you. It was such a strange choice of words. If they didn't mean to scare me, why creep around the house in the middle of the night? Why try the doorknob? None of it made sense. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. In the timestamp of the email, the sender had used a different time zone. A small clue, but enough to suggest they were still in Europe. That ruled out a random hacker or scammer. This was personal. I blocked the sender and changed every password I could think of. I even contacted the police in France, forwarding them the email and recounting the story in detail. They were sympathetic but said there wasn't much they could do unless the person made direct contact again. Weeks passed and nothing else happened. But then, late one night, I got another email. This time, it was just a single line. You're safe now. No context, no explanation. It didn't make me feel safe at all. Since then, I've done my best to let it go, but I can't help but wonder, was it really Sylvie's ex? Was it someone else entirely? And what did they mean by you're safe now? Had something happened to them or to Sylvie? I never heard from her again, and the cottage seems to have disappeared entirely from rental sites. So, to the person who sent those cryptic emails, I hope you really have moved on. And to Sylvie, wherever you are, I hope you're okay. But to whoever was behind that door, to whoever thought it was okay to terrify a stranger in the middle of the night, let's absolutely never meet. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and at the time, I was working the evening shift at a coffee shop. My shift ended around 11 p.m., and because the shop was in a quieter part of town, the parking lot was usually empty by then. That night started like any other. I finished up, locked the doors, and walked out to my car, which was parked near the edge of the lot, close to the tree line. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavier than usual, but I didn't think much of it. I was just eager to get home. As I got closer to my car, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. A man was standing about 10 feet away from it. Just staring. He wasn't moving or saying anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, facing me. He looked like he was in his late 40s, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. I hesitated, thinking maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone, but something about him felt off. I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual. "Oh, can I help you?" He didn't respond. His face was partially in shadow, but I could see enough to know he was smiling, this weird, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. Now I was getting nervous. My car was the only one left in the lot, so it was obvious I was alone. I decided to play it safe. I turned around and started walking back toward the coffee shop. That's when I heard him speak, and his voice made my skin crawl. "You forgot something." I stopped but didn't turn around. My keys were in my hand. My bag was slung over my shoulder. What could I have forgotten? Before I could respond, he added, "Come here. I'll show you." Nope, absolutely not. At this point, every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there. I picked up my pace and made it back to the shop door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the key, but I managed to get inside and lock the door behind me. Through the glass, I saw him still standing there, but now he was closer to my car. He was holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but he waved it at me like he was trying to taunt me. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the tree line. I stayed in the shop for another 20 minutes, calling a friend to come pick me up. When they arrived, we checked around my car together. There was nothing unusual, except for a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It just said, "See you soon," in messy, scrawled handwriting. After that night, my anxiety went into overdrive. I'd been independent for years, but suddenly I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere alone, especially at night. The sight of any man loitering around made my heart race. My friends and family tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some weirdo trying to scare me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. About 2 weeks after the parking lot incident, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. First, it was a car, a beat-up, dark sedan that I kept seeing parked near the coffee shop when I arrived from my shifts. It wasn't in the customer lot, but rather across the street, facing the building. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, but then I started noticing it at other places too, near my gym, on the street by my apartment, even outside my grocery store. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Plenty of people have old sedans, right? But then came the second thing. One night, as I was locking up the shop, I found another note. This time, it wasn't on my car but taped to the back door of the building. It was the same messy handwriting as before, but this time it said, "Miss me." My blood ran cold. I didn't tell my coworkers because I didn't want to freak them out, but I did call the police again. They sent an officer out, but once again, there wasn't much they could do without a suspect or tangible threat. A few days later, I came home from work and found my apartment door unlocked. I froze. I was 100% sure I had locked it when I left that morning. My heart was pounding as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place at first, but then I saw it, a single red rose on my kitchen counter. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just some random creep trying to scare me. He had been inside my home. He knew where I lived. I called the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They checked for signs of forced entry but didn't find any. They suggested that maybe I had left the door unlocked, but I knew I hadn't. I started staying with a friend after that because there was no way I was sleeping in that apartment alone. The scariest part, the notes didn't stop. Every few days, I'd find one in places I couldn't explain, slipped into my locker at work, tucked under my windshield wiper, even inside my gym bag. Each one was more unsettling than the last. One just said, "Soon." I eventually decided to move. I couldn't handle the constant fear anymore, and the police weren't offering much help. I changed jobs, switched apartments, and even got a new car to try and break the pattern. For a while, it worked. I didn't see the dark sedan again, and the notes stopped coming. But then, a few months ago, I got a text from an unknown number. It just said, "You look good in red." I had been wearing a red sweater that day. After that text, I felt my entire body lock up with fear. I sat on my couch for hours, staring at my phone and trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just some random spam message or a cruel coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't respond to the text, but I forwarded it to the police. They assured me they would look into it, but given how little they'd been able to do in the past, I didn't have high hopes. I changed my phone number the next day, but the damage was already done. I knew he had found me again, and no number or lock or distance was going to stop him. A week later, I was at home, trying to relax and put it out of my mind. I had all the curtains drawn and the doors triple checked. I was watching TV when I heard a faint sound outside, a soft tapping, almost rhythmic, like something brushing against the window. My heart dropped. I froze, listening intently. The tapping stopped, and for a few moments, everything was silent. Then came a new sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging along the glass. I wanted to believe it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch, but I couldn't convince myself. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the nearest window. Slowly, I lifted the corner of the curtain and peeked outside. There, in the glow of the porch light, was a man. He was standing just a few feet from my window, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt, but I could see his smile smile, that same tight-lipped, unsettling grin that haunted my dreams. In his hand was a single red rose. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I dialed 911. When the operator picked up, I could barely form a coherent sentence. I managed to tell them there was a man outside my window and begged them to send someone immediately. When I dared to look out again, he was gone, just vanished, like he had never been there. But on the window pane, scrawled in something dark and wet, were 3 words, "See you soon." The police arrived within minutes, but as always, they found nothing. No footprints, no rose, no trace of the man who had been there just moments before. They told me it could have been a prank, maybe some kids messing around, but I knew better. It was him. After that, I couldn't stay in that house. I packed up and moved in with a friend, explaining only that I was dealing with a stalker. They were understanding and let me crash in their guest room while I tried to figure out what to do next. But the scariest part of all this, even though I haven't seen him again since that night, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, I'll catch a glimpse of a dark sedan in my rearview mirror, or I'll feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I'm walking alone. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.